Welcome back to Agile Apothecary channel. My name is Masha and here we talk about everything Agile and a little bit about Japan. Today I would like to talk about Scrum and Kanban. How to choose the right framework for the team, what is the criteria that we need to look at when choosing the framework, and what are the things that we need to be cautious about. It is true that both Scrum and Kanban are the most popular Agile frameworks nowadays, and quite a lot of organizations nowadays choose Scrum because there are many certifications around Scrum, many courses, many trainings. Also, when you're scaling Agile in the organization, a lot of scaled Agile frameworks such as SAFe, LESS are built on top of Scrum. However, Kanban is also quite popular, but unfortunately quite often misunderstood. A lot of people tend to think that as long as they're using that Kanban board, they are following the Kanban framework, which is not necessarily correct, because Kanban as a framework means that you need to apply certain principles, you need to of course visualize your workflow, but also you need to, for example, limit work in progress, you need to apply pull not push principle, and you need to implement continuous improvement in your processes. So today I want to talk about Kanban as a framework, not just a board, and we are going to look at 6 criteria which would help us to make the right decision for the team, whether it's Scrum or Kanban that we need to apply. Let's get started. So number 1, and probably the most important criteria, is asking yourself whether iterations make sense to your team. Because if they do, if it makes sense to break your development cycle into short iterations, deliver value incrementally every couple of weeks, every 3-4 weeks, then probably Scrum would be your framework of choice, because it really helps you to organize those processes, helps you to do planning for each iteration, review the results, and build this cadence. However, some teams don't need iterations. For example, if they're doing continuous delivery and they are delivering value every day, why would they need to make it every 2 weeks if they could do it every day? Or their development process is so long that it does not make sense for them to break it into parts. So that probably would be more of waterfall scenario. And remember, waterfall is not bad on its own. In case of waterfall, if you break it into shorter iterations and apply Scrum ceremonies, that does not make you agile. So in that case, probably Scrum won't really help and won't make a lot of sense. So if you were to choose between Scrum and Kanban only, having iterations or not having iterations would be one of the most important deal breakers. Let's move on. Number 2, do you have a high predictability? What does it mean? It means that you as a team can say in advance how much work you can complete in a certain period and what you're going to work on. So we don't want to look a few months ahead, but we need to be able to say at least a couple of weeks ahead what we are going to deliver if we want to apply Scrum as our framework. Because otherwise, how are you going to plan your sprints? Sure, you can make your sprints, let's say 1 week, if you can only predict for 1 week ahead. But then if you make it shorter, the balance between the time you spend in all those meetings, like planning, retrospective, review, daily stand-ups, versus the time you actually spend developing the product, the balance is not very great. So if you are not able to see at least a couple of weeks ahead, if you don't have high predictability, then Scrum might not really work for you, and Kanban would be probably a better choice in this scenario. Number 3, how often does your work get interrupted? Teams that are dealing with a lot of customer requests, with some support requests, often get their work interrupted because there is something urgent that needs their attention that they need to take care of. In that case, it becomes really hard for them to have high predictability that we just discussed. So a team which is developing a new product, on the other hand, would have less interruptions, probably because they're not dealing with customers. they're not dealing with support, with bugs, etc. Of course, once your product is live, quite often you would have to deal with these kind of requests while continuing to develop your product, but it's all about the relative amount of those interruptions to your work. Because if you spend, let's say, 30% of your time dealing with this kind of requests, you still can confidently plan for 70% of your capacity to allocate to product work, and in that case, you probably would be able to still plan your sprints. If you have more than 50% of interruptions, or this percentage just varies every week, you have different ratio, different percentage of interruptions, planning sprints would be very inefficient, very difficult to organize, and probably you would want to prefer Kanban over Scrum. Number 4, does your team have handovers inside it? Of course, ideally, we would want to have cross-functional, self-organizing team where everyone works on all kind of work, people collaborate smoothly, and there is no handover necessarily from one team member to another. Not always happens in reality, and this kind of arrangement is not always necessary. So there are situations where you would have, let's say, engineers, developers on your team, and you would have testers. So then what happens? We start the work from scratch, we plan sprint, there is 0 items in progress, and then testers have nothing to do for a while because nothing has been developed. Then towards the end of the sprint, developers dump a whole bunch of work onto testers and they try to complete everything to complete the sprint. And of course, some work gets carried over then to the next sprint, creates some tension in the team, it creates very poor distribution of work and causes a lot of problems. So if that happens, I wouldn't say that Scrum is necessarily the best approach. Of course, you can make it work, but consider Kanban, consider implementing more continuous flow in this case, and this would provide more visibility into potential bottlenecks and will help you to distribute the resources more equally. And in the end of the day, it would allow your team members to have better work balance. Number 5, can you fit regular meetings into your schedule? Scrum is relatively strict about the ceremonies that we need to have. At the beginning of the sprint, we do have to have a planning. Then in the end of the sprint, we need to do sprint review and retrospective. And then every day we need to do daily stand-ups. And somewhere between the planning and the review, we need to also do the backlog grooming, backlog refinement, so that we have enough work for the next sprint, for the next planning. Some teams can allocate time for it and have those ceremonies just fine, while other teams, especially again, if they're dealing with a lot of uncertainties, a lot of interruptions, if you have team members which are allocated to more than one team, sometimes it's just not feasible to have all those ceremonies, and people need to change the timing, change the cadence and scheduling once in a while, and that means that Scrum is not really working for them, because once you start changing the length of the sprint, you lose this whole beauty of time boxing, iterations, fixed intervals, you start losing your predictability, you can't measure your velocity, and that leads to a lot of other problems. Of course, in Kanban as well, we would need to have some sort of planning, some sort of review, some sort of retrospective on regular intervals, but we can be a bit more flexible about it. We don't need to care that much about the time boxing, so Kanban would allow for more flexibility when it comes to scheduling. And last but not least, number 6, what does your team want to do? It's very important to ask the team members' preferences, and they should be the ones choosing the framework for them, understanding, of course, all the pros and cons and getting some advice from Agile coach or from Scrum Master. But in the end of the day, it's also important to understand the personal preferences. Some people really love Scrum because it gives them the clear start, the clear finish. It creates this opportunity to celebrate the little milestones, little successes, while Kanban for this kind of people would feel a little bit boring, a little bit endless. On the other hand, some people don't like those constant interruptions and starts and finishes, so they would prefer to just stay in this continuous flow of Kanban. And for certain reasons, people just tend to be allergic to one or another framework, maybe because they did it before, it did not work really well for them, so they just don't want to hear anything about it. And while we would want to change those misconceptions and clarify the real principles and show them what the good looks like, it's also important to take those preferences into account. I hope that gave you some insight into the approach when choosing the right framework for your team. And remember that you should not be afraid to mix and match and see what is working for your team and take different components, different tools from different frameworks and build your own custom frameworks that would help your team to be efficient, productive, motivated, and happy. Let me know if you have your own know-hows or any questions in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.